Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. We are thrilled to have back with us Tom Malinowski, former congressman from the 7th District of New Jersey and former assistant State Department official who was the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, a post which no longer exists because this administration doesn't really believe in labor, democracy, or human rights. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Jen. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you. So let's back up a few days to the Alaska abasement, in which we literally rolled out the red carpet for Putin. How did we go from threatening sanctions to rolling out the red carpet and greeting a war criminal on U.S. soil?
I it's been very hard to keep up with the whirlwind for the last few days, and I think the best way to explain it is that like Trump likes the theater. He likes the drama, and so much so that he skips all the steps that you need to actually go through to make diplomacy successful. Um, with a guy like Putin, if you actually want to make a deal with him that's not a terrible deal, you need leverage. You need to put pressure on him because he's not going to do anything um, hard unless he has to, unless we make it so that it is in his interest to do the thing that we want him to do. And so, yeah, you're right. We threatened sanctions, and the administration did impose one so-called sanction. It was a tariff on imports from India designed to get the Indians to stop buying Russian oil. But that lasted like 24 hours. And they didn't then go after all of the other countries that are buying Russian oil. The Indians responded by actually cozying up more to Putin and the Russians. Russia felt absolutely no additional pain from any of this. And then 48 hours later, they're invited to come to Alaska and to walk over the red carpet and past the American troops kneeling on the ground, rolling it up, creating this image that Putin has gleefully exploited. And then when he drove a hard bargain with Trump, Trump caved again on what was arguably the most important issue, whether Russia should cease firing, should stop bombing Ukraine before we got into discussions on these really complicated and difficult questions that would have to be resolved to actually end the war. And so
And,
Putin loves that.
and why is it in Ukraine's interest to have the ceasefire first, and why is it in Russia's interest not to have the ceasefire
Yeah.
first?
So, if Trump wants the theater out of all of this, what Putin wants is delay. Putin is an expert in clock management. And whereas the administration officials interviewed all over the place now are kind of making the rookie diplomatic mistake of saying, well, it's great that they're just talking. Talking is great. The Russians, and particularly Putin, see talking as advantageous to them so long as they can keep bombing Ukraine while these talks and discussions are going on, because then they can use the talks and discussions just to drag everything out, to delay having to make concessions as their military makes incremental progress on the ground. Um, so that's why Ukraine, I mean, and all the Europeans and everybody who's rational has been saying you got to have a ceasefire to A, test whether Russia is serious, and B, to take away this advantage that Putin has in delaying ultimate resolution. Um,
The optics of the so-called press conference, which turned out not to be a press conference because no questions were allowed, was rather stunning. Talk to us about how a president should conduct one of these sessions and how it went in Alaska.
well, you shouldn't conduct the session unless you have something to announce. I mean, the press conference Again, they're skipping all the steps. Normally, you negotiate a deal, and the deal is not negotiated by the leaders. We'll get into that a little bit because I want to talk about
Yes.
this plan for a Putin-Zelensky summit in a minute. But normally, you have negotiators. They agree to something. Then, when you have something real, the presidents, the leaders come in to finalize it. They're the closers. And if all of that works, then you put them out in front of the public to make statements and to answer questions. But clearly, all of the steps leading to that final one did not happen. And then they still put them out in front of the press with absolutely nothing to announce, which gave Putin, a small win of getting to stand there with the president of the United States as an equal, but without forcing him to take questions, which, past American presidents who've had summits with Putin, with Russian leaders, have usually insisted on a press conference because at least that's like the only time that Putin ever has to answer a question from someone who doesn't work for him.
Right.
And so he was protected even from that, from having to do that in this event.
And of course, he droned on in Russian for quite a bit going first. And then Trump sounded kind of old and lost and rambling like he usually does. So the contrast there was quite great. So fast forward to Monday. Zelensky comes to the White House with what I can kind of only describe as bodyguards, sort of the entire EU delegation, to make sure Trump was not going to throw him out again. Zelensky learning the first lesson of Trump diplomacy, which is dress nicely and say thank you many, many, many times, did both of those things. What happened from there, and what kind of trouble are we in now?
Well, look, it's great that the European leaders came, but think about what this means. I think they've been referred to as like the Avengers. You call them the bodyguards. I thought of it more as a bomb squad, where Trump is the bomb and he could go off at any time, and so you needed like the entire top leadership of Europe to come to the White House with the singular objective, all of that diplomatic and political capital, all dedicated to making sure that the president of the United States did not blow up in Zelensky's face. And the good news is they succeeded. The bad news is that diplomatic capital that should be spent pressuring Putin is being dedicated to managing the problem of the United States of America.
Right.
So that's strange and it's sad, and I'm glad it worked, but that doesn't advance the goal of ending the war in a way that's just for Ukraine and in American interests.
What about
Um,
this idea of having Zelensky and Putin meet one another? Not clear that Putin would have any interest in doing this because, of course, that would be conceding that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country with its own head of state. But why does Trump think that's a good idea? And are the Europeans just going along because they think it will never happen?
so again, this is not the way peace diplomacy usually works. We're trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza. Nobody's saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu must sit down with whoever the leader of Hamas is today. Like that would be crazy. No, you've got negotiators on both sides. And obviously the leaders have to agree in the end to whatever they come up with, but you don't put them in the room together. Trump is saying that he solved all these wars around the world. He hasn't, but let's assume he has, right? Let's assume that India, Pakistan was like this great thing that Trump did. I don't recall the leader of India, Modi, sitting down with the leader of Pakistan to get that ceasefire. That again, that's not how it normally works. And if you think about the Russia-Ukraine context, like Putin cannot, if we want Putin to make concessions, he's not ever going to make those concessions directly to Zelensky. because he believes that Zelensky is a stupid little comedian who's not worthy of being in the same room as the great man Putin. So if such a meeting were to happen, Putin would use it to try to dominate Zelensky and to lecture him about how he's abusing Russian speakers or whatever, you know, why Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist as a country. And likewise, if we want Zelensky to make concessions, he also cannot make them to Putin because that would be political death to him. He would have to use that meeting to demand the return of Ukrainian children, to confront Putin on the daily drone strikes and missile attacks that are killing Ukrainian civilians. So, like these two men can only make concessions to us or to the Europeans. They can't make those concessions to each other. So, like any experienced diplomat would tell you, no, this could be a disaster, and it's certainly not going to be the way to solve the problem. What you need are, okay, you can have Russian-Ukrainian negotiators at a lower level, and then ultimately kind of proximity talks where they're all talking to us, and we broker something that in the end, Putin and Zelensky will agree to and sign. Um, but again, for Trump, it's about the theater, and that would be great theater, right?
Now, I had some fun in a column today, although the issue is serious, saying a security guarantee from Donald Trump. Frankly, we gave Ukraine at the end of the Cold War a security guarantee that said if they gave up their nuclear weapons, we would stand by them and protect their sovereign integrity, their territorial integrity. And that turned out to be really not the case for a couple presidents. And this president, who tried to extort Zelensky, and who probably hasn't ever made a promise he hasn't broken, does not seem like the kind of character for whom a security guarantee would have much meaning at all. So, what is all of this talk about a security guarantee, and what would a real guarantee actually look like?
Okay, so now we're on to the substance. And the substantive issues are security guarantees, land, sanctions, the kidnapped children. So let's go through that. Um, I don't know what they even mean by security guarantee. And I don't think the Trump administration knows what it means, or maybe different players within the Trump administration have different views. Steve Witkoff said it would be like Article 5. And as you know, Article 5 is the heart of the commitment that NATO makes to its members. It's a legally binding commitment that if a member is attacked, the other members will do whatever is necessary, including go to war, to defend it. I don't know if Steve Witkoff understands that, and I cannot imagine that Donald Trump would give that kind of guarantee to Ukraine. Um, are we going to put troops in Ukraine to be a kind of tripwire, like we had troops in Germany during the Cold War? Again, I don't see Donald Trump doing that. So then what is an American security guarantee? Is it, as you suggested, just like some promise from Donald Trump, I'm the greatest man in the world and I have your back, but what does that mean concretely? Does it mean the Europeans promise to put significant numbers of troops in Ukraine with some backup from the United States? What does that mean? None of that has been defined. And don't forget that in any of these scenarios, the most obvious thing that the United States would do is just at least give aid to Ukraine so that they can have a strong army.
Yeah.
And as Rubio and others have made clear, Vance and I think Trump too, that we're done giving any military support to Ukraine that doesn't involve Ukraine purchasing the weapons from us and from the Europeans. So like at the very least, you got to like resume aid to Ukraine if there's going to be a security guarantee, because that begins with a strong Ukrainian army. Um, So that all remains to be defined. And meanwhile, Putin, like, does he agree to any of that? Um, he may have hinted at something in Alaska, which made these guys all excited, like, oh my God, maybe he'd be willing to consider something. But that doesn't mean he would actually agree to any of this anytime soon, especially since he's allowed to keep bombing as long as the talks go on.
Now, one of the things that Trump started piping up with after Alaska was, yeah, we really need to do these land swaps. That's Putin talk for give us what we've already gotten and give us some more land that we haven't gotten to militarily.
Yeah.
What about land? What
So
is a reasonable resolution?
yeah, so the only way land swaps make sense, swap obviously suggests both sides give up something, is if you have a front line and that front line is not necessarily rational or easy to defend in every spot. And they're, you know, may not be straight. It may have like pieces that are jutting in and out. So in a normal peace process, you might say, okay, we're going to make some adjustments on both sides so that we end up with something that's more solid and easy to defend. Maybe like we make it run along a river somewhere, or a ridge line. Um, but that's not what Russia's talking about. They're not talking about a swap. They want Ukraine to just give them a large part, at least of the Donbass of the Donbass, that that the Russians have been too weak to conquer militarily, and that the
Yeah.
Ukrainians have expended many lives defending. Why should Ukraine give that up? Especially when you consider that this isn't just land, it's people. There are about 200,000 people living in the parts of the Donetsk province that Ukraine currently controls and that Putin is demanding. Those people can't, like, you can't give those people to Russia, so they would have to leave. It would be a massive effort of transferring that population to other parts of Ukraine. What about their homes? What about their businesses? What about their factories? What about their farmland? Who pays for all of that? How long does that take? No one has thought about this apart from the Ukrainians who understand that it's crazy and they don't want to do it. Um, so, like, I think to Trump, it's like, it's just like lines on a map, and you get this and you get that, but there are real people's lives that are affected by this in a very profound way, and also the small problem of not wanting a world in which great powers can change lines on a map by force. Um,
One of the issues underlying this has been whether there is a legal recognition of the lands that Trump stole the last time in Crimea, or whether there's just sort of um, a de facto kind of ceasefire line there. Talk to us about that, about what the 2014 land grab, how that could be resolved.
so the 2014 land grab was Crimea and a big chunk of what we refer to as Donbass, which is Luhansk and Donetsk province. Um, Russia has expanded on that, obviously, taking more of Ukraine. They lost some of what they took, but they have more today than they had in 2014. And where everybody, I think, agrees realistically is that Ukraine is not going to be able to take back those territories that Russia currently occupies militarily. They tried with our help, but the cost is too great. And so the realistic compromise that I think we can expect Ukraine to make is a promise that they will no longer try to take back those territories by military means. Um, which would be a huge concession to
Yes.
but one that I think, it just has to be made. But if that were to happen, that doesn't mean that we should force Ukraine to legally accept that those territories are now part of Russia,
Yes.
nor should we accept that. Um, and there's a long tradition of that. The Baltic states, during the Cold War, obviously we understood that they were controlled effectively by the Soviet Union, but legally the United States never recognized the annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Today, Russia occupies parts of the country of Georgia in the Caucasus. And, no one's, it's not going to change. Georgia's not going to invade those territories and take them back. We're not going to go to war with Russia over those territories, but we don't recognize the legal annexation because of this principle that's so important to keeping the peace of the world since World War II, that borders should not be changed by tanks. So that's the reasonable outcome here, that you say, okay, Russia, we get you, you're going to keep those lands. Ukraine's no longer going to take them back by force, but you don't get legal recognition.
Now, one of the issues you indicated was the problem of the children. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of children being kidnapped. Is there a resolution that would conceivably involve their return in return for any Russian prisoners or some other humanitarian thing that Russia wants?
Yeah, well, I think that the best resolution is just a comprehensive return of people. And that means prisoners of war. It also means these kidnapped kids. And I think any American would understand this, that you can't expect people to stop fighting when their kids have been kidnapped. Like, and any of us, right? If our kids were being held by kidnappers, we would not accept peace with those kidnappers without our children being returned. I think the most conservative, kind of MAGA isolationist folks in the United States of America would get that. So this has been discussed. Melania Trump wrote a letter to Putin, which Trump passed to him in Alaska. That's okay. That's good. There are a lot of conservative influencers who have been pushing the Trump administration on this because child trafficking is such a big issue on the conservative right. It should be for all of us. And then there was this weird Truth Social post that Trump posted yesterday, in which he mentioned Melania's efforts, but he framed it strangely as part of what he called a worldwide problem of missing children. And he didn't mention Russia or Ukraine. He said, the First Lady, and he mentioned Ursula von der Leyen, the EU chief, as having raised this, but again, as a worldwide problem of missing children, not as Putin kidnapping Ukrainian kids. As if he was kind of playing to kind of this QAnon, they're stealing our children everywhere
Right.
thing, instead of just saying the simple thing, Mr. Putin, return those kids.
It's interesting also that Donald Trump now has a newfound concern about trafficking children, because that's,
Yeah.
we should be doing everything we can to hold those people accountable. Um, let's take a step back now. Where are we? We didn't give away the store. We didn't sign over all of Ukraine. So good point there. But where does that leave us and where do we go now?
Well, the good news is the Western Alliance lives to fight another day, and
Right.
Ukraine lives to fight another day. 90% of the diplomacy over the last 8 months has been focused on, again, on trying to influence Donald Trump not to abandon those things. And so far it's worked. But where things go on ending the war, I still think Putin is engaged in time in clock management. Um, he's gotten several major concessions. One, at least less pressure for a ceasefire as a precondition for peace negotiations. Um, a definitive statement from the United States that we will not provide any additional military aid to Ukraine. So the rational, I think, thing for Putin to do is to continue to wait and see, to play along as much as necessary to keep Trump and Rubio and Witkoff saying that there is a diplomatic process, that we're talking, that things are going well, even as the drone attacks and the missile attacks continue and his military takes a square, you know, a football field every 3 days or something on the ground at great cost, and just to see how this plays out. And maybe at
And
some point he has to compromise, but not now. That's I think where his head is at.
and there's
And
this other body in the United States called the US Congress, and they used to have a role in foreign policy.
yes,
What should they be doing?
well, I think, there's the sanctions bill, which all the Republicans say they support, but they won't actually move it without Trump's permission. And to be frank, like the sanctions bill, all it really does is to give Trump authority to impose sanctions. It
Yes.
doesn't mandate. So it's not really a forcing mechanism in the way that I would want it to be. I do think that Democrats have more agency, and in this case, the pro-Ukraine Republicans and the Democrats have more agency than they sometimes feel. Like even there's statements that they could make that would be very powerful. For example, that we're never going to, whatever Trump may say about recognizing Russian control over these territories, we do not recognize that. And any future administration, like if I were Democrat, I'd be saying any Democratic president in the future would withdraw any legal recognition if it were granted by the Trump administration. It hasn't yet, but if it were, I would be talking about sanctions and my conditions, if I were a member of Congress, my conditions for lifting sanctions on Russia. There is a law in place today called CATSA. I forget what the acronym stands for, but we refer to it as CATSA. And it actually requires the president to submit to Congress any proposal to lift sanctions against Russia. And it gives Congress the opportunity to have a vote before any sanctions are actually lifted. I would be, I'd be saying now, and I'd be rounding up all of my pro-Ukraine fellow members to say, not unless there is a reasonable deal. And here are our conditions. Send that signal now to the negotiators that Congress is not going to necessarily lie down for an unprincipled deal. And again, all it takes is all the Democrats plus Brian Fitzpatrick and a couple of other Republicans who still genuinely care about Ukraine for that to be a credible threat. So don't wait. Don't just like wait and react to whatever Trump does. Be proactive would be my advice to Congress.
And I would just add one thing. When the JCPOA was being negotiated, Republicans kept saying, well, unless it's a full treaty, unless it's ratified by 2/3,
Yeah.
the next president can change it. And sure enough,
Yeah,
the next president did change it.
sure.
So if Russia wants a permanent deal, they're going to have to do it the right way. And a subsequent Democratic president could well say, "Yeah, this was done by that crazy guy, Trump, and we're going to start rearming Ukraine, and we're going to make sure that Russia lives up to all the promises that they haven't kept over the years."
This goes for NATO membership too.
Absolutely.
Like it's Trump Trump can say it's perfectly fine that he doesn't think Ukraine should be in NATO. Um, by the way, Rubio made a contradictory statement. He made like for once said something I can really get behind. A few days ago he said that that no one should be able that Russia shouldn't be able to veto Ukrainian membership, that every country, including Ukraine, should be able to choose its alliances. Doesn't mean they get in now.
Yeah.
Their right to get in the future should not be taken away. And then Trump went out and said never to, never NATO. And remember, he said because Russia would never allow it.
Yes.
But again, if I'm like leading Democrats should be saying now, like any Democrat running for president now
Yes.
should say, I'm not going to be bound by whatever these guys decide on NATO membership. I'm not saying that like I'll do it on day one, but I'm not going to be bound by some commitment that Ukraine can never join NATO. Like that should be part of the conversation now so that negotiators know that they cannot permanently block this. Putin should know that Trump doesn't have the power to permanently block it.
And I would just add that before anyone takes any security guarantee from Donald Trump seriously, they should look at his statements about his existing guarantees and his existing statements about Article 5, which kind of blows hot and cold. But it's good that every once in a while Rubio emits something that sounds like a principle that he once held. So we should encourage all of that.
You should.
Thank you so much, Tom. You bring light to a dark and murky diplomatic situation. Let's hope that Congress is listening and some of them start piping up. So we'll look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you so much, Jen. Have a good day.
You too.